think we can start. We have 11 in the morning here and 8 in the evening in Sydney. So very welcome everybody, especially Tanya Evans, for accepting our invitation, and we look very much forward to your presentation. And before I hand over to Stefano Dall'Aglio, who organized this autumn cycle of our seminar series and your event in particular, a special welcome to our students. So I'm very glad to have our students of the new Laurea Magistrale, which is our new master program on digital and public humanities, and several students also from the new study program in environmental humanities, so which is an even even newer field of research. So digital humanities. So digital humanities already seems to be ages old. So environmental studies humanities is a very lively new field of research, and we have a new study program here where we have some overlap also with classes, which I enjoy very much. So welcome everyone from this study program and from the Center for Humanities and Social Change, who is running this new study program. This seminar is going to be recorded, and we will publish it on YouTube, on our YouTube channel of the VeDPH, and so everyone be aware of this. Otherwise, if you after the presentation, there will be a discussion we organize via chat and a voce. So Stefano will moderate the following discussion. And that's all I have to say. For those who don't know me, I'm Franz Fischer, the director of the Venice Center for Digital and Public Humanities at the Department for Humanities at Macquarie University. And I look very much forward to your introduction first, and then to your presentation of your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to Venice.
Yeah.
My name is Stefano Dall'Aglio. I am one of the team members of the VeDPH, Venice Center for Digital and Public Humanities. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to my students of the module of Introduction to Public Humanities. And also there might be some of my students of the module on public history workshop. And good evening, well, good morning to Professor Tanya Evans. She's connected from Sydney, and I think it's 8 o'clock in the evening right now. I'm sorry for keeping you up so late. So, Tanya Evans is Associate Professor at Macquarie University in Sydney, where she teaches public history and modern history. She's the director of the Center for Applied History. Her books include many titles. The only one I'm going to mention today is the prize-winning Fractured Families, Life on the Margins in Colonial New South Wales, published in 2015. She has also published many scholarly articles and book chapters on family history. She curates exhibitions and works as a consultant for TV production companies making historical documentaries. She is currently finishing a book on the practice and meanings of family history in Australia, England, and Canada, and undertaking collaborative work with family and local historians on archaeological project in the Blue Mountains. Today, she's going to talk of history, heritage, and environmental change in the deindustrialized landscape. Tanya.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me. It's wonderful to meet you in this kind of rather socially awkward, but nonetheless exhilarating kind of way. And I should probably mention a book that's just recently been published as well with some colleagues here in Australia, Paul Ashton and Paula Hamilton, that's just been published by De Gruyter called Making Histories. And it's a collection, an edited collection of public history chapters from a range of public historians and academics around the world that your students and hopefully yourselves might find useful. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to move to sharing my screen and hosting me. Can you see that? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
It's not full screen though. Yes, now it is.
Good. Now we're good.
Perfect.
Excellent. Right, and thank you so much, Stefano, for that lovely introduction. And I need to acknowledge my colleagues, Professor Lucy Taxa and Associate Professor Sean Ross here at Macquarie University, who helped bring some of what I'm speaking to you about this evening or morning, whatever it is, whatever time in the world it is with you today. As you've mentioned, I am Director of the Centre for Applied History here in Sydney. I trained in Britain as a social and cultural historian, and for years I wrote on the history of the family, and I still continue to write on the history of the family. But for the last 10 years or so, I've increasingly come to think of myself and label myself and my work as public history and as a public historian. And like lots and lots of public historians, I am really passionate about researching ordinary people and places in the past. But what I've increasingly come to do in my work is incorporate those people and places in the construction of historical knowledge. Again, like lots of public historians and people who work in the digital humanities, I am profoundly and politically committed to the democratization of historical knowledge, collaborative research practices, and the co-creation of knowledge. And what I'm increasingly doing with my work is trying to chart the impact of collaborative and community history projects. And I'm sure in Italy, it's the same as here in Australia and back in Britain, where I spent many years being trained as a historian. There's a lot of emphasis on impact and engagement. And I think these terms are bandied about a lot, and it's important that we take them seriously as scholars, and public historians need to make clearer to historians and scholars in all sorts of disciplines, what is the impact of working with communities? You know, how can we, what is involved in the democratization of knowledge? And I think this is increasingly important work in a context, in a neoliberal context around the world, where the work that we do within universities and the tertiary sector is being challenged from all sorts of angles. Australia is, you know, the Australian government is at war with the tertiary sector at the moment, and it's important that those of us who work in the humanities and the arts make strong cases for the importance and significance of the research, teaching, and collaborative work that we do. So this is where, you know, the focus of my work has really been placed in the last few years. And with teams of scholars in a variety of national contexts. I'm on the steering committee of the International Federation for Public History that brings together scholars working on public history around the world, with scholars in Britain who work on family history. I'm working in collaborative projects, trying to break down boundaries and silos between people who work within academic contexts, people who work within the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, and museums, and trying to bring us all together around the same table to communicate the significance of the knowledge that we're producing and to engage all sorts of diverse communities in that process. I'm also part of a research network, an arts and humanities research network that comes out of the United Kingdom, working with Professor Joanne Beggiato and Associate Professor Laura King, as well as colleagues in Australia, Associate Professor Katie Barclay and Dr. Ashley Barnwell at the University of Melbourne, on a project called Inheriting the Family, which is also a profoundly collaborative project. So this is where, you know, a lot of the work that I've been doing lately is focused. I'm on sabbatical at the moment, which is magnificent. I'm getting a break to finish up a project that I began a few years ago, which is comparing the practice and meanings and impact of family history in Australia, Canada, and the UK. And I'm going to finish that book up by the end of the year. But that work that I've undertaken on family history over the last few years has really informed the project that I'm going to be talking to you tonight about, or today about. Sorry, I'm going to keep, it's very dark outside this window, so I'm going to keep referring to the nighttime, so forgive me for that. So as I've suggested, my recent projects have focused upon family history, and I'm really, really interested in the way in which a focus on family history, genealogy, the ways in which ordinary people, millions of ordinary people around the world are working on family history, and how it's enabling them to think historically and to produce distinctive forms of historical understanding. And it's my argument, and the argument of colleagues that I'm collaborating with, that this production of historical understanding challenges an academic monopoly of historical knowledge. And it's clear to me and my colleagues that family historians, ordinary, community, local historians are still being marginalised by academics in this process. And this is something that I think, and others like me and who work with me, think needs to be challenged. And so my focus on this project that I'm going to be speaking about is on community and collaborative history that really is focused upon including family and community historians in its remit. So I started off as a historian of 18th century London, so I didn't speak with many real live people in the process of my research, and some of my current 18th century historian friends would say that that's exactly the way it should be, right? But I have increasingly come to enjoy working with real people in the process of my work, and a lot of my work has been collaborative. Stefano mentioned my book Fractured Families, which brought together work in collaboration with family historians that was also undertaken in partnership with Australia's oldest surviving charity, the Benevolent Society of New South Wales. And what we did was produce a history of colonial New South Wales together. And this was a really exciting project and has formed the basis of a lot of the work that I've done since. And I've continued to undertake workshops with family, local and community historians around regional New South Wales and elsewhere across Australia, trying to get family historians who've spent decades working on their family histories, collecting enormous amounts of historical information, trying to get them to think about what to do with the research that they've been gathering, and to think about what outputs they might produce. You know, that might be books for their local community, but it might be websites informing people about their research, or blog posts. And you know, I know, for example, there are so many Canadian family historians have extraordinary websites dedicated to their family history, disseminating their knowledge and their research in really innovative and exciting, creative ways. So I've increasingly sort of tried to get family historians of all sorts of ages to think about what to do with the research that they've been gathering over the years. And this is work that I really, really enjoy, that has informed some of the work that I'm doing in our current project. Another project that I worked on a few years ago was a history of my local swimming club. And this was one of those little kind of side projects I did that was really a teaching project at the time, but was also came to light because I was a member of his swimming club, and so were my children. And they were about to celebrate their centenary. So, and it's a beautiful spot on the lower North Shore of Sydney. And I now teach Australian history. And in Australia, like lots of settler colonial nations, it's really quite hard trying to get young people excited about their own national history. They'd much rather study Nazi Germany or ancient Egypt than they would study the history of their own nation, the history on their doorstep. So I wanted to use a project like this to get young people interested in local history, my children interested in local history. And so this was another collaborative project that I put together with colleagues within my department who were also members of the swimming club. It's important to combine your health and well-being with the work that you do and your teaching. And this was one of those projects that was a lot of fun to work with, that was also incorporated students in the process, resulted in this book, a beautiful coffee table book, and an exhibition at the local library, and just had lots of different outputs that I now use as a teaching project as well. So again, this informed some of the current work that I'm doing. So here we are in the Jameson Valley. I don't know if many of you have travelled to Australia, but here is a shot of the beautiful Blue Mountains. And you know, as I've suggested, a lot of my work has been focused internationally as well as within Australia. And I suppose it was rather beneficial that during this year of COVID, we received Australian Research Council funding to begin this project. And I should state that this really is a project that hasn't taken off because of COVID. But we have undertaken some preliminary work that I'll talk to you a little bit about in the process of talking you through. But it's a gorgeous, gorgeous space in the Blue Mountains. And it brings together a large team that I will describe to you in a moment, and to focus on really the first collaborative and multidisciplinary scholarly and community-based study of this forgotten shale mining settlement in the environmentally and culturally significant Jameson Valley. With this project, we hope to advance knowledge and enable cross-generational engagement with the history and heritage of an industrial landscape, hoping to improve our understanding of the long-term impact of deindustrialisation on localities and their social and cultural environments. By combining archaeological, archival and oral evidence, the project aims to provide new insights into everyday working and family life, community, gender, transiency and migration that can contribute to conservation of this site and its industrial heritage, its cultural heritage, tourism and educational and environmental change. So at a place, I'm going to go back to this shot because it will help us transport ourselves there to the Jameson Valley. At a place called Ruin Castle in the rugged Jameson Valley near Katoomba in New South Wales lie the neglected remains of a shale mining village. Archaeological elements identified during a pilot study undertaken in 2018 include 20 structures attesting to habitation between 1880 and 1914. These preliminary results demonstrate the potential insights offered by a comprehensive, in-depth study of the site's tangible and intangible cultural heritage. And the bushfires in late 2019 at this site throughout the Blue Mountains make this research both timely and very urgent. So this year, and hopefully the years ahead when the research can really take off properly, provides a unique opportunity to work with our partners that include the National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute, as well as 2 New South Wales-based heritage consultancies to produce a test case assessing the impact of bushfires on heritage sites, while also providing resources for industrial heritage conservation, education, and cultural heritage tourism in the context of environmental change for the local community. So the overarching goal of this project is to advance scholarly as well as cross-generational knowledge about everyday life in a relatively isolated industrial community and the long-term impact of its deindustrialization and ruination by giving flesh and voice to the people who inhabited and labored in this space. To fulfill this goal, our team will work with a range of different evidence to bring some of this space and its people to life. And we want to translate this evidence not solely into data sets and scholarly publications, but also documentary and multimedia stories, heritage listing applications with management plans, accessible narratives, and multimedia content for walking tours, school excursion kits, and online exhibits, and other public-facing resources, furthered by development of a software platform to facilitate content delivery for educational purposes and tourism. And it's our argument that such outputs can make a significant contribution to conservation of industrial heritage and cultural heritage tourism, thereby helping our partner organisations fulfil their heritage responsibilities and public outreach needs, while also producing educational content for other stakeholder and end users that include community members, the residents within the Blue Mountains area, many of whom are profoundly passionate about history, local history and otherwise, tourists and school children. So we want to collect and analyse new material evidence through archaeological survey and excavation in and around the ruined castle mining settlements. And this kind of pile of bricks that you can see in the slide is one of those miners' huts with a hearth at the back. And we want to combine this archaeological evidence with legacy data from our pilot study undertaken in 2018 to produce a comprehensive digital heritage inventory, applications for heritage listing and heritage management plans. We also want to deploy and assess best practice digital methods, including digital data capture and processing of archaeological, oral and textual data to support dissemination of comprehensive data sets using appropriate repositories and digital tools that can be employed for academic research and used by our partner organisations for heritage management purposes. So we want to produce, as I've suggested, both traditional historical accounts, your usual monographs and journal articles and conference papers, as well as multimedia digital content that lots of us have experience of working with within television environments, but also other multimedia environments. We want to make this material accessible to a wide audience, also the local community as well as tourists. And we really want to engage lifelong learners, both inside and outside the academy, who are passionate about local, social, community and family history and industrial and environmental heritage to facilitate their contribution to this project and ensure its capacity to promote intergenerational learning by school children and tertiary students. So I'm going to give you a little background on shale mining, because until I began this project, I knew loads about family and social and community history. I knew very little about shale mining at the time. So I'm just going to give you a little snapshot of the circumstances around shale mining in the 19th century. So torbanite, also known as kerosene shale deposits, were first discovered in New South Wales in the early 1800s. Torbanite is used to produce gas for lighting and oil. And exploitation of deposits expanded around the world after 1850. Oil was first commercially extracted from Australian shale in 1865 by the pioneer kerosene works at American Creek in Wollongong, which is much further down south and south of Sydney, about an hour and a half south of Sydney. And the discovery of shale at Dall'Aglio in the Southern Highlands, again kind of southwest of Sydney in 1874, prompted the formation of the Australian Kerosene Oil and Mineral Company in 1878. And Dall'Aglio became the largest and best known oil shale mining operation in Australia. By the turn of the 20th century, Australia was recognised as having the richest oil shale deposits in the world. And so in 1880, oil shale was identified at Ruined Castle, this site where the miners' camp grew up, and in 1882, North commissioned prospecting work. And the Katoomba Coal and Shale Mining Company was formed in 1885. Shortly afterwards, a settlement grew up around here, tunnels were created, and an aerial ropeway was used to haul shale from the valley. A financial crisis in 1889 in September temporarily closed the mines, which were then leased out. And the 60 miners who had been working there in 1893 were cut to 40 by 1896. And the mine was eventually closed in 1897. So the mine had a very kind of quick turnaround. It had a short history, but it left those huts and evidence of those lives there behind. In 1903, it briefly reopened, but the ruined castle mines and all of their associated settlements were abandoned by 1905, and the land was left in, quote, a desolate mess, which took years to recover. So for many years, nobody but walkers throughout the Blue Mountains knew anything about these huts, and many of them were obscured by overgrowth and trees and all sorts of bush that covered them. But in 2018, a pilot project was conducted at Ruined Castle by the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute. And a number of this project's investigators and partner organisations were involved in the survey of these small areas around the Ruined Castle mine. And this archaeological survey inventoried over 250 surface features, artefacts, scatters and isolated finds, including structural elements like I showed you before, like stone platforms and drilled boulders, some ironwork, glass and ceramic fragments from the local pub, like this one, the Carrington Hotel that was in Katoomba, as well as refuse and latrine pits, both close to the mines and also further down into the Jameson Valley. And this preliminary survey was undertaken with research on documentary sources in Trove. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Trove, but it's this amazing resource put together by the National Library of Australia, which allows you to search the contents of libraries, galleries and archives throughout Australia to become aware of, the books that they hold, but also the archival documents and images and material culture that they have within them as well. And it has proved enormously useful and fruitful for Australian researchers, but also international researchers as well. So we undertook a work on Trove, particularly on the digitised collections of newspapers, local and otherwise, bringing together all of the documentation and stories about this site together. And we will continue to do that as the project progresses. And there are some very helpful collections also in the Blue Mountains Local Historical Society and in the library, the local libraries as well. Very passionate local librarians have often pieced together the life stories of families in this settlement. So there's all sorts of potential for piecing together the family histories of miners and their descendants in this area. And we've managed to make contact with a few descendants of those miners that are still living in the area today. And we want to kind of gather their memorabilia and their oral histories of this site. So this hotel, the Carrington Hotel in Katoomba, was most of those miners' watering hole, and they weren't drinking water, obviously, watering hole of choice. And this was also where petty fracas frequently played out. There's all sorts of fights that play out in this hotel between the miners, their wives and their dependents. There are records associated with a number of men who were known to have lived in these huts. And, we have researchers and ourselves piecing together those stories to reveal the details of those personal and employment lives and the rivalries between miners and their families. We had hoped this year to undertake a history harvest, and I'm sure you've heard of history harvests, where you gather members of local communities, you put a call out to people to come together and share oral histories, perhaps participate in focus groups, and also share and show and digitize memorabilia, photographs, material culture associated with the site and the stories of the people who lived and worked there. We're using other sources as well, court and public inquiry records relating to mining accidents and legal disputes to piece together the working and living the lives of these miners and their families. And many of these men were profoundly transient. They moved from mining sites in Newcastle, coal mining sites in Newcastle, further up the coast from Sydney, and Wollongong that I mentioned before. These were poor, low-skilled, desperate lives, and they dragged their families or sometimes abandoned their families in a number of these sites, and were piecing together those transient lives on the margins at this time. So we argue that this, I won't go there yet, the ruined castle landscape, this site, this space, this beautiful, ostensibly beautiful part of the Blue Mountains, which has a kind of a sort of darker deindustrialized side. We're arguing that this landscape is a prime example of deindustrialization and ruination. These are related subjects some of you may be aware of that have attracted deeply interdisciplinary attention from literary and cultural studies scholars, labour historians, economists, industrial anthropologists, geographers and others. Coal mining communities have featured in studies of deindustrialisation, plant closures and ruination. However, most have focused on developments in the late 20th or early 21st centuries. According to Strangleman et al., more careful attention needs to be brought to bear on the cultural significance of industrial change over time, including on how individuals and communities reinterpret deindustrialisation through the lens of memory. To this end, many studies in this field have drawn on oral history methods to explore relationships between memory, place, community, and identity. And here, the notion of the landscape looms large. For Emery, memories of work and community before the collieries closed are embedded within coalfield landscapes. And while the literature references the material landscape, features and artefacts relating them to memory, it has rarely incorporated archaeological scholarship, which has its own discourse on collapse and ruination. By contrast, this multidisciplinary project that brings together scholars who work in archaeology, history, the study of work, deindustrialization and industrial heritage will help shift that focus. And our project assumes that understandings of cultural landscapes needs to draw on artifacts, monuments, sites and memory narratives, that narratives and material culture are both equally tools of memory, and that memory narratives can enhance archaeological interpretations of place. So our project team and the people who have been largely responsible for drawing a lot of this work together is Professor Lucy Taxa, who is in the Macquarie Business School, who has expertise in oral history and industrial heritage. As I mentioned before, Associate Professor Sean Ross, and those digital historians amongst you may know of his work in e-research and the software platform that we're using for this project, FAMES. He trained initially as an archaeologist in the US. Dr. Penny Crook, who is an historical archaeologist, does a lot of our artifact work, particularly in ceramics and glass. And Dr. Susan Lupak, who is in our ancient history department. Well, actually, no, we used to have separate ancient history and modern history departments. We're now a big department altogether, and we're history and archaeology. So we're all now one big family, which is lovely. And me as well, drawing on my expertise in Australian history, social, family, local community, and public history as well. But we also have on board the wonderful Professor Stephen High, based at Concordia in Canada, who is a world-renowned expert on deindustrialization and ruination. So we have this academic team, but we also have our heritage partner investigators, Fiona Leslie and Beck Parks, who are involved with heritage consultancies based in the Blue Mountains and elsewhere across regional New South Wales. And as I mentioned before, the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute and the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And I don't know what your funding bodies are like in Italy, but the Australian Research Council is very keen to encourage what they call these linkage partnerships, and with the funding we have is it's a linking scheme where we're trying to draw on these links between these different communities and bodies in order to produce scholarship that has a multiplicity of uses, and it produces very significant and exciting opportunities, we would argue. As I mentioned before, the bushfires that occurred late last year that we thought were just, they were extraordinary. And I can't tell you, this year has been extraordinary, but when those bushfires came, even Sydney, many miles away from the Blue Mountains, is about an hour and a half from us here in Sydney. The clouds of smoke and dust were just with us every day. And I would take my dog walking along the harbour and you couldn't see the boats in front of you for the clouds. And these bushfires have had a monumental impact, environmental impact, also social and cultural and economic impact on these areas. This has almost been forgotten in the wake of COVID and its impact on Australia. And even though the summer that was about to, we're in our spring at the moment, we're about to go into summer, and many of us are frightened of the possibility of more of those bushfires upon us, even though it's claimed that we're due to have a wet season. But we need to think, historians need to think how best to communicate the significance of this space and this place to contemporary Australians as a result of these fires. And again, Franz, you talked about the benefits of COVID and our capacity to communicate across national boundaries using technology. We've got to look for the silver linings, and I've always been one of these people that looks for the silver linings. And the bushfires did produce a silver lining with this project, because it cleared much of the Blue Mountains, which made a lot of these sites and these camps that were obscured by trees and the canopy. It cleared all of that, which has made the research much easier for us this year. And so we've undertaken a couple of research trips to assess what's there and what can be gathered, and it has produced an extraordinary amount of data. But this is research that needs to happen quickly because the regrowth is occurring very quickly. It's amazing how quickly you can see here the trees that have been blackened by the fire, but you can see, and here that it's revealed a lot of the artifacts, that the ceramics, the glassware, and the irons. So it is very timely research. And again, here these huts that the miners lived in, they normally lived. What we have gathered so far is that the miners would live as individually within these huts. Sometimes they were larger, incorporating families, and so they would just have a tarpaulin over their roof. And let me tell you, you might think Australia is hot, and it mostly is, but the Blue Mountains can be just extraordinarily cold. So this was a bitter environment, especially in the depths of the valley, which is where this was. So you can think of that beautiful vista that I started with, and they're in the depths of the valley. So it's freezing cold and not a fun place to live and work by any stretch of the imagination. So we really hope that this project enables us to focus upon, and I think I produced a reading, I don't know if any of you have had a chance to read it, to focus upon the concept of memoryscape, something that Toby Butler has talked about when producing his audio tours. We think that our interdisciplinarity can enable us to do that in important ways. We can bring together our focus and our conceptualization of the landscape, of deindustrialization, ruination, and memory together by thinking about memoryscapes. And to think about, the lived processes of living in this area. And what, like I've suggested there, we're working with local and community history organisations, and especially Aboriginal community organisations, and our local and community organisations that we have met with already and want to kind of bring into the fold of our project. And as I've suggested before, and a lot of my writing in the last year or so has argued that, when I've met with family, local and community historians, they're really passionate about being part of the work that we do as academics. And they have felt marginalised, and they have felt denigrated and derided for years when they have tried to converse with, communicate with historians. And I recently wrote a paper with Jerome de Groot, who's based at the University of Manchester. I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work. And what we wanted to do with that piece of work was to query the notion of public engagement. Remember, I started off talking about this, about what we mean by public engagement. And to think, or to remind ourselves that a lot of publics, and of course there's all sorts of ways in which we might define publics, but all sorts of publics are left cold by academic scholarship, by disciplines, by the conventions, and in some ways, this process of presenting over Zoom and Facebook and Teams enables lots of people to come to the academic table, but there's all sorts of conventions that we find ourselves trapped within as scholars that don't change over time. For those of us that have been academics for 20, 30 years, some of the conventions around presenting your work excludes all sorts of communities. And Jerome and Matthew and I really wanted to trouble some of that in the article we wrote. What might we learn by inviting different communities onto our tables, learning from them rather than attempting to engage them? Our universities, our employers put a lot of weight on our capacity to engage with communities. They don't often examine or define what they mean by that. And some of us will put down that we give a multiplicity of talks to diverse audiences, etc. But, Jerome, Matthew and I wanted to argue that when we talk to different audiences, we're not necessarily engaging with them. It's still a top-down power relationship, and it's often a passive process. We're often speaking. There's not that much interaction. There might be a question and answer situation, but, it's still it's still a one-way process. And there's still a kind of element of didactic pedagogy that we're not troubling in that process. So what I hope with a project like we're working on in the Blue Mountains and these other projects that I've been working on over those few years, I hope that we can trouble that and move on from that. Because if public historians are committed to democratizing history and broadening audiences, I think we need to work much harder at explaining the impact of this work through a variety of case studies like this. And part of what I'm doing in conversations with public history colleagues around the world is trying to gather examples, successful and not successful examples of case studies of collaborative community history projects. And public history scholarship tends to shy away from critical analysis of community and collaborative history projects, often because they involve commissioned work, and people don't want to rain on the parades of people who have paid them to undertake work for them. And it's more often, and this is work that's more often celebrated rather than critiqued. But I think it's really important that we understand that work as scholarship, not just to make claims about the significance of public history, but also to get our colleagues who work in the broader discipline of history to value the work that public historians do. How might knowledge of the outcomes of these sorts of community history projects contribute to international public history scholarship? And that's the kind of question I'm going to be working with for the next 5 years or so. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the matter.
Thank you very much, Tanya. This was fascinating. And I wish there was some sort of virtual applause as traditional conferences, but this is one of the things we miss and Zoom online conferences and lectures. Anyway, this was amazing. There was so much at the stake. I'm really glad that our seminars are mostly focused more on the digital aspect. I'm really glad that we have this opportunity to focus a little bit more on the public aspect, dealing with so many questions at the same time, because we have been talking about community history, local history, public engagement, what public engagement really is, the idea of democratization, the history and approach to history is also really fascinating. And also one of the other aspects I really find extremely interesting is we're able to establish a connection between history, something that everybody thinks it's pertain to only to the past, to the present and possibly to the future. We're talking about the fire. We're talking, of course, of processes that are still ongoing, the industrialization and environmental change and cultural heritage. So I think this is really a way to have the perception of the present, the significant of understanding history, of understanding what has happened in the past, even if it's a recent past. And the last point I wanted to make is that really it was an opportunity for us to open up a window on a geographical context that I think most of us really didn't know anything about. Because we have so many opportunities to listen to lectures on Italy and Europe and maybe the US, but really the Blue Mountains is something really we have to learn about. So I think really there is so much at stake, and I'm also glad you had the opportunity, often apart from talking about your own research, also mentioning some general aspects related to what discipline is, what could be, what should be, and some of the problems, some of the issues related to how it is conceived. So I open up the floor to discussion. I hope there will be interesting questions because, as I said, this talk was really about many different topics, many different problems, not just related to the historian's work, but also to more broadly to the humanities scholars' work. So if there isn't anybody else, I'm really happy to break the ice. I was wondering, as I was listening to your talk, I was wondering about the interaction with the living sources, because I work in early modern history. Unfortunately, I have no opportunity whatsoever to interact with my sources. I work on traditional sources, printed primary and secondary sources. I assume that interacting with the people, family members and community members for your own research is, on the one hand, is a wonderful opportunity. On the other hand, it might be problematic because to what extent are the people happy to contribute, to collaborate with you? To what extent are they able to accept maybe outcomes, maybe directions that the research takes that maybe are not completely the ones they would hope. So contrary to the sources I'm working with, I think there is the problem of interacting with them and also, well, establishing some sort of empathy, but not, but also keeping a distance with them at the same time. So could you say a little bit more about it?
I could say a lot. I mean, I think it's really important for us to write about it as well. I mean, of course, oral historians have been doing it for a long time. And in many ways, my work with family historians and community historians parallels a lot of the scholarship in oral history. So we work with the same concepts that a lot of oral historians work with. And we work with the same ethical processes and procedures as well. And I'll talk about a couple of examples. One with the work that I did with family historians. All of them had to sign a consent form. All of them I engaged in the writing process, shared drafts of chapters, and they were all happy with the outputs. However, after that book was published, I then wrote a piece on the history of domestic violence and the ways in which family historians were revealing histories of domestic violence within their own families and what impact that was having on them. And I argued in that piece that, you know, the very high profile that was given to domestic violence in the Australian environment as a result of a particularly horrific case of domestic violence had encouraged family historians to undertake research on their own family their own family histories. They had discovered these stories and it had a huge impact on them. And I published this and in collaboration with one family historian, but another family member from the same family took real issue with the story. And for him, it was something that was just a sign of the times. And we were using a contemporary lens to misappropriate and misinterpret that story. So that was a good example of that kind of the rough and tumble of what happens when you disagree about a particular historical example, and that wasn't resolved for him. Right, he was unhappy about that process. And another example with that swimming history that I worked on with my local community. Again, that was my chapter, and that was a history of the female swimming champions across the 20th century, a story that hadn't been told at all in Australia. Like in many national contexts, the history of sport is structured around male athleticism and not female athleticism. And for me, I was writing a chapter, it's a feminist history of female swimmers. And one of the swimmers that I interviewed, who I also involved in a collaborative process of, you know, passing on drafts of the chapter and the blog posts that I was using as a draft for the chapter that I wrote for the book. She was very unhappy with the story I wrote. But what it resulted, and I've written an article about this, a scholarly article about this, because again, I think it's important to reflect on that process. What I said in that was that if that had happened at an early stage of my career, I'd have been devastated. I'd have been, you know, if somebody had been really cross with my interpretation and of events, I'd have been crushed in that process. And what I actually did was to use it as an opportunity to talk about what it is that historians do. Because of course, we know what we do. We've been doing it for donkey's years. We've been trained in it for, years. We've done our undergraduate degrees, our postgraduate degrees, our PhDs, our postdocs. What we forget to do sometimes is explain to other people what it is historians do and how we construct historical knowledge and the stories we tell about the past. And what had happened with this particular lady is that I'd pieced together articles from Trove. I talked about that, the newspaper resources, but Trove doesn't have all of the newspapers that Australia has published. It's got only some newspapers, and it's a digital repository. They're adding to it all the time, depending upon funding. And so what I tried to explain was that I had tried to triangulate my sources as best I could. And what I wanted to do was tell an engaging story about her life. But it was not the story she wanted me to tell about her life. So what we did was we kind of engaged in this kind of historiographical rough and tumble, where I tried to explain what it is that we do and why it is that we're doing it. And I said to her, we can withdraw your story. It's okay if you're not happy with this. It doesn't have to play a part in the book. But she didn't want that either. So it seemed to me that she enjoyed the argumentation and the disputation about the story we were going to tell about her life. So yeah, it's not easy, Stefano, is what I would say to you. But what it does is remind us that we need to communicate what we do to others more effectively. And that's what I try and do. And I do the same with the family historians, that I'm trying to get them to think about their outputs, because we say the same to our students, right? It's not good enough just to research and read for as long as possible. We actually do need to write about the stuff that we're researching and reading, and to share that knowledge with others. I think it's important that other people do that too, and to think about the significance of that knowledge, right? And why it's important to share it. So yeah, I guess I'm more confident about having those conversations now, but I'm not. It's not easy.
Thank you. At least my witnesses are long dead, so none of them has ever complained about what I wrote. Okay.
Their descendants might. But their descendants might.
Not yet, so far. Anyway, we have several comments and questions in the chat. The first one in the list, I think, it's one by Franz Fischer, our director.
Okay, yeah. So, thank you very much for bringing us so far to this fascinating place in the Blue Mountains, which I never
heard of.
Chance to be unheard of, actually. Okay, yeah. So I love public history, and so also someone in the chat also loved the term history harvest. I was about to say the same. So, and I tried to imagine the situation. So how you are harvesting history by inviting the local community, and then I think it's a common place. So history is about the present. That's, a common thing, and I very much think that this is true, and this is maybe even more true if you do public history, if you engage with people and find out about their relationship to historical facts or issues. So it's more or less, it's very much a contemporanean history, or even sociology or psychology about living communities of today. So I wonder what are you expecting? So now your topic is about a settlement, industrial settlement of the late 19th century. So what is your actual, so you don't want to determine already the result, because this should be an open process, which I very much agree, otherwise it doesn't make a lot of sense. So what is, but of course you have an expectation. What will be the outcome of this project? It's not just about sharing what you know with the community, but bringing up what the community has, and so discover things that are in living in the communities. There are more than 100 years past, 3-4 generations past in between. So it's more about now and the relationship to these remnants and ruins. So what are you hoping, or what do you expect, or what from your research? It is historical research, but what will be the result?
Well, look, we are hoping to engage the local community in that intergenerational conversation about the site. This is a site that most people don't know about, even though they live next door to it. and to get them to think about, you know, the surprises on your doorstep. You know, this is, you know, you never knew this had happened. It was a bit like with the swimming club. You know, people didn't give a moment's thought to the history of a swimming club or the people that dive from those platforms. And so it's getting people to think about history as something that is exciting and something that they can be invested in and that has significance for their contemporary lives. And to get school children interested in it, as well as to engage those older people who have those memories and those stories, who may need to be incorporated and included in the community in different ways. So there's that. There's also about trying to get more tourists too. So when the government and others exhort those of us who work in the arts and humanities to monetize the work that we do, which most of us find distasteful, to say the least. This is one way in which we can do that, right? Tourism, as we have discovered in public history and cultural heritage tourism is one way in which we can get business and the government to get excited about history as well in these forms. That is really important. And to get people like yourselves, I imagine almost none of you have ever traveled to Australia, to encourage you to think about, and lots of people think that Australia is a new nation that was discovered in 1788, and people, you know, many Australians have to engage with its much longer history for all sorts of reasons, and to think about those international comparisons as well. I mean, there is that scholarship on deindustrialization and ruination that is international on the US and Canada and elsewhere, and these sites, you know, we have much to learn from each other if we examine them and their history and their present significance, but also just the scholarship on the history of the family, on social history and cultural history and environmental history. There's so much we can learn from the gathering of all of this diverse material and the piecing together of those stories and their significance. So yeah, there's all sorts of things that we hope to, and I'll, you know, if you're willing to have me back in 3 years' time, hopefully we've got more things to show you from the delights of the project.
It would be great. Okay, we have another question from Heather Content. Heather, would you mind switching your video on and ask your question yourself, or you want me to read the question from the chat?
I can talk. Hello.
Hello.
Hi there, Heather. Nice to meet you.
Me too. I actually just moved from Australia.
Hey!
Yeah, and I even had my graduation party at the Carrington Hotel.
Oh my goodness.
But I was wondering, yeah, so the term history harvest, that was a good term for, you know, describing the methodology of talking to people. But I was wondering if you have a similar kind of term or way of describing your analysis of the oral histories. I know in the past, you know, certain Australian funding bodies are like, yeah, but how do you analyze them? Do you look for the number of times they say I, or, you know? So I'm just wondering if you have a way of describing it in this, you know, it's kind of a documentary co-writing sort of thing. And how do you describe that methodology?
Yeah, I haven't seen it in the ways that you're suggesting. I'm reading your chat as well, the question in chat as well. I haven't seen it in those ways. I mean, only in the ways that oral historians talk about analysing their work, which is never, which isn't often, I think, in the terms that you're suggesting there. And it doesn't have that formal methodology. And what's important, though, is that we have to make those claims sometimes, and to think about how we label the work that we do so that we get people to take it seriously. But yes, I don't know if I've got, it's interesting because the history harvest is almost, I mean, it's a term that came from the US initially, and it's one that we've used in the network that I'm involved with, the Arts and Humanities Research Council network, Inheriting the Family, one that we were hoping to use this year at a range of different locations in Britain and Australia, gathering family historians together with all of their memorabilia. We had one on photographs, for example, where we were going to get family historians to bring in photographs and we'd talk about the significance of photographs. photographs and the meanings for them as well, and also use it to record those photographs. But no, I've not come across any terms to do that. And actually, what's interesting, History Harvest seems to indicate community work, and that is something that is cordoned off from what is academic work. And it's important that we stop that boundary construction. And I don't yet think we've got the terminology to do that, but that is certainly something, and that's certainly something that Jerome and I were suggesting, and Matt was suggesting in that article as well. We've got to come up with a different formulation. Yeah, we've got to break down those conventions that have really, they're new conventions, right? They've only existed since the late 19th century with the professionalization of a discipline. You know, they're not that old. So why are we so set upon sticking with those conventions in order to justify the work we do, our expertise and our authority?
Yeah, great, thank you.
My pleasure.
Your microphone, Stefano.
Okay, yeah, I forgot it. Our next question comes from Eleonora Zordan. Eleonora, would you be happy to switch your video on and ask your question?
Yes. So my question was about common people in your research. So how do you interact with them and incorporate them in your research, and if they have like a positive attitude? And I was wondering if maybe sometimes it's hard to get like a true information, because maybe people feel influenced by social constructs or conveniences, so they don't feel like at their ease, and they have difficulties in expressing their self. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a few questions and I think they're really interesting. So firstly, in terms of getting people kind of engaged and interested, I think you have to work really long and really hard at doing this. You know, this is one of the other things I'm writing about at the moment. I mean, some of you may have read it if you read that Love Thy Neighbour chapter, but a lot of the work that is done with communities and this sort of collaborative work that I do in my teaching as well as my research, it's often invisible labour, right? And I think it's really important that we make it visible. Because a lot of the time that we spend trying to build up relationships with a range of different organizations is labor that is often just not recognized or acknowledged. So it takes years, right? And I know that there are PhD students that can send off a call for information, and that happens definitely. And I've certainly done it myself. You know, I've asked Ancestry.com in Australia to share via social media a call out to participate in research that I've undertaken. That has helped. But actually, I think what's most helpful is, for many, many years, I've given lots of presentations to family, local and community history organizations. So just by kind of engaging with those communities, you can build up trust, and they recognize that you're not there just to kind of steal their ideas. You know, that people have often worried about academics, if they've worked with family historians in the past, sort of exploiting people as interview subjects and taking data and then running away with it. And a bit like you were saying, Stefano, running away with it and doing it with what they wanted with it, you know, which is some of the early critiques of oral history, I think, in the early years. And I think it's important to build up that trust, and it takes some time. They don't always have a positive attitude. Lots of people do. I mean, the people I work with, family historians, are very passionate about sharing their knowledge and their experiences, but not all of them, of course. I mean, the project that I'm writing up at the moment, this book on family history, what I did with that is actually work with surveys. So that helps to get around some of that awkwardness, Eleonora, that you're referring to, where people, you know, might be nervous. You know, like lots of oral historians suggest that, you know, when you first sit down to interview an ordinary person, they'll always start off by saying, I've got no idea why you want to talk to me. I don't have anything important to say. I'm not important, and you're wasting your time. Right. And of course, that's not true. And I think everybody's got an interesting story to tell. Not all my colleagues think that, but I think that. And I think it's my job as an oral historian to draw that out. And some people are much more comfortable than others doing that. But with that project, I started with surveys and then sometimes followed up with oral history interviews. But of course, I analyse the language they're using, Eleonora. So for me, I would, as I read through their responses, whether they're survey responses or oral history transcripts or interviews, I would think very carefully about the language that they're using, about the social constructs that they might be situated within, about their nervousness, and I'm very, for me, the project that I've just been working on is a history of emotions project. So I've been very careful to try and elicit their emotional responses and the emotional impact of their research. So I think it's just an important focus upon sensitivity with your subjects and respectfulness, right? Yeah. And to be conscious of that, you know, that they're taking time to share their knowledge and experience with you, and you need to respect that.
Okay, thank you. And can I do another question? Can I make it? So I read that you're also interested in motherhood and sexuality. So I was wondering if you could suggest a reading or a textbook or books referring to this theme, like motherhood, especially.
Oh, loads, loads. Which context, Eleanor? In Italy or elsewhere?
Actually, yeah, well, worldwide as well. So I don't know, because I read about motherhood and I wrote a dissertation as well, and but it was more focused on novels and literature. So yeah, it wasn't written like very I don't know, maybe social.
Okay. I tell you what, Eleonora, maybe if you drop me an email and we can have a conversation outside of this, and I'm very happy to help you with some resources.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Microphone, Stefano.
I'll leave it on next time. Okay, our next question is from Carolina. Carolina, would you ask your own question?
Thank you, Stefano. Good morning and good afternoon, Tanya. Thank you very much for sharing with us your research. I am visiting scholar at the center in Venice, but currently I am talking from Madrid, so I am another country. And I am conducting a research on interpretivity and public engagement. And I was wondering if are you interested in introducing also perhaps user-generated content strategies, maybe with the young generations, and introducing these new technologies, these innovative digital technologies that maybe can be closer to their way of thinking about life and the relations they have nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's not my area of expertise, to be honest, Carolina. That would be Sean Ross's area of expertise, and that's where he would be looking at that. What's interesting to me, though, is that I've got I at my local dog park, I've got a friend who is really into a lot of his learning-based technologies as well, and he cannot wait till we can do face-to-face interviews. I don't know whether in your countries you're allowed to do face-to-face interviews yet, but we've been banned all year really since doing them. I know that he and I cannot wait to at least get filming, just produce really high quality content so that we can then look at the options for all sorts of, for walking tours, for all sorts of things. Again, this is not my area of expertise. I've got, more students now trying to produce walking tours than I've ever tried to do in my life. But I think that there's all sorts of wonderful options out there. What do you find particularly useful in your own work, Carolina?
Well, after listening to your work, I find that maybe the technique of mashup could be very interesting. Like the thing of reappropriation, this term of taking images and contents from others, maybe members of your family, of the context where you live in that case, and reshaping all this information in an innovative way. And in that's the way in which we can have another point of view on the reality, a generational approach. And I think this is very interesting, and it's something I do with my students with materials from YouTube. And the final results are very creative. Yeah, and in terms of social research, it's also very, very rich. I think it can be useful.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Could you send me a link if possible? Would that be okay?
Yeah, I am planning to write some papers on that, because I am always doing this, and I think that it's also useful for research. So this is the moment in which I am trying to do something more concrete, and I will for sure share it with you.
That would be great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tanya.
Okay, still going through the chat. Of course, there are people thanking for a wonderful talk and so on. I'm skipping those, but the next question is from Petra. Are you there, Petra?
Yes, I'm here. First of all, thank you so much. I have question similar to the one Eleonora asked, but I'm more concerned with the Venetian case. In fact, I really feel that there is a huge gap between, in the Venetian case, between Venetian history experts and the local population. Indeed, it is plenty of cultural institutions and researchers, also in the university, of course. But for instance, we still do not have a modern center about Venetian history, culture, and environment too. And I think it could be one of the reasons why Venetian people are not so interested in their local history, and it should be, as it should be in the case of a unique city as Venice. And in the article, Love Thy Neighbor, Local and Community History, you highlight the importance of schools, libraries and events in engaging local community. And so I was wondering if you could share with us some other practical strategies or tools used to encountered, or encountered to engage common people in their local history. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for that lovely question, Petra. And I think it's really interesting, because I can imagine people are really interested in Venice from the olden days, but not from the so recent days. And that's a real problem. It's the same with Australia, right? It's a very uni-focused sort of history. So I've talked already about the kind of family and local historical organisations, what I've done there. I've given lots of talks, and also like local libraries and state libraries. I don't know what Italy's like, but here in Australia in recent years, young people, particularly those studying for what's called the HSC, the exam that you have before you leave school at 18, they flock to local libraries and they do all their revision there. And so what I've found myself increasingly trying to do is to talk to those children. I have teenage children, that helps, right? That gets me into schools and things like that. But I also, as part of the work we do at the university, as part of the outreach work, we're always talking to students. We're talking to history extension students, we're talking to students. The university gets us to do it so that we encourage them to come to our university. We do it so that we engage with them and get them passionate about history. So talking to school students is really important, and particularly with that local focus. And I've certainly found that students just, they had never thought of this local history as being significant, right? Because nobody had ever pointed it out, which seems ludicrous. But when it's not part of the curriculum, and it's often not, but in Australia it's part of the primary school curriculum sometimes, but it does not play a part in the high school curriculum. Those other bigger topics take priority. I think it's important to remind them. So for me, it's really trying to communicate with those students in the local libraries. I'm trying to get them to think about these spaces, which I don't know what they're like in your country, but here there's been, a significant amount of public money has been pumped into local libraries so that they're kind of engaging with their local communities. But what I want to do is to get young people not excited about the free Wi-Fi that's in the libraries, because yes, that is why they're there, and they've produced these beautiful social spaces that they can talk in, because when I was growing up, you couldn't talk in your library, you had to be really quiet in your library, and now I can't study there because they're so darn noisy. But that's exciting, right? They're filled with young people, but we need to get those young people to think about these libraries as repositories, archival, and they're collections of knowledge, and they can create knowledge using the archives there. So to get them to think about their space differently. So that's the kind of work I do. Again, is giving a lot of talks and engaging with those communities is really important. But I think for me, I'm involved in another project with education scholars. and psychologists in trying to encourage conversations between adolescents and people in aged care to talk about history. So it produces social benefits for people in aged care who are isolated, and often, well, at the moment they're completely isolated, but when we constructed the project for funding, they weren't as isolated as they are now. But what we wanted to do was encourage adolescents who are studying history to understand themselves as oral historians, to engage in conversations with older members of their communities, non-familial members, to learn about Australian history through these people. Who are in their 80s and 90s, and to talk about historical change with them through their life stories. And in that process, hopefully, get adolescents to understand the significance of that storytelling and to engage with Australian history in a way that they hadn't been up until that moment. But also to get older people, so my colleagues who are the cognitive psychologists and the educational scholars, they're interested in it because for older people, talking about history gets them improving their memory skills and much improves their quality of life, okay? So it has all sorts of significance. And again, this goes back to getting people to think about, why is history important, right? It's important for all sorts of reasons. This storytelling may seem insignificant about our life stories, but it's not, right? It's got all sorts of functions. And, it's important that we get 15-year-olds and 80-year-olds to recognize that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Great. So, Elisa, do you want to ask a question? Tanya?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Tanya. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm applying a similar approach in a landscape that is characterized today by an industrial hub and also a series of strong landscape transformations during the centuries. And I'm curious about the fact that it seems to me that these examples I have in my mind are related to a particular situation, extreme events, natural landscape transformation, strong anthropical changes, mining, in your case, exploitation, that are characterized by a very long-term interplay, a delicate balance between people and environment. So, is this true for you? And if why? and if this kind of approach could have a better impact of this kind of memory scape, because only in this case you can identify yourself with also an intangible environment in a better, in a stronger, in a more emotional way. So what a community really wants to remember from its past. So thank you.
Yeah, I can't answer that yet, Elisa. I think it's a really interesting question. And I think that the research that we do will help to tease out some of those tensions. And you're right, that the community may not have any interest, or large members of the community may not have any interest whatsoever. And there may be conflict, as Stefano has suggested, about the stories that we might want to tell. And of course, the partner organisations might have different motives and rationales as well involved. And these are all tensions that I think we're going to have to juggle in the next few years, and let's see where the path takes us. But I look forward to hearing about your research as well and reading about that too.
Okay, thank you very much again.
I can't answer.
Our question comes from Evelina. Are you there?
Hi. Sorry, can you hear me?
I can, Evelina. Nice to meet you.
I'm sorry I have to wear a mask.
If you could speak a little bit louder.
Okay, I guess I could. Can you hear me well now?
That's better.
I can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to ask you, so as far as I understood, you are working primarily with Australian population. And considering that Australia is a very multicultural country with people coming and still immigrating from different parts of the world, I just, when I was in London, when I was doing my Erasmus there, I met a girl from Australia who identified herself as ABC, Australian-born Chinese. So
despite the fact that she was born and raised in Australia by immigrant parents, she told me how when she was a child, she was treated differently by Australian kids. So it made me think about the fact that when you interview, when you communicate with Australian population, do you consider that these people might have identification biases, and whether people see themselves as Australians or they see themselves as I don't know, some coming from other culture, and whether it is a mix, and whether, you know, the things that they were hearing from their parents, like all this mixture of cultures. How do you overcome this, the possibility of people being biased in a cultural way? Thank you.
That's a really great question. Of course, when we talk about communities, it's a really complicated term, particularly in a settler colonial nation, as you suggested, Evelina. And with my work on family history, I asked them explicitly about it, okay? And again, this goes back to some of the other questions I've had already. I've engaged with specific cultural communities. So I've talked with the Australian Jewish Genealogical Society, I've talked to the Australian Lebanese Historical Society, I've talked to the Australian Chinese Historical Society. And these are societies that have become really interested in family history. And in fact, the argument of my book is that the policy of multiculturalism in Australia and Canada that emerges in the 1970s has had a profound impact on making people much more confident about articulating their heritage, their cultural heritage, and their distinctiveness from white Australia. And this is because for decades, and those of you who are not familiar with Australia may not know about this, but for decades, Australia was sort of structured by what was called the White Australia policy, which was exclusionary for, you know, all migrant groups really, apart from the POMs, from British migrants. And you're asking someone who now is a dual citizen, so I am both British and Australian, so I am profoundly interested in people's mixed cultural heritage, partly because, you know, like lots of historians, you know, a lot of my work is about troubling those national boundaries, particularly in this digital age. I mean, look, we're having a conversation, you're in Italy, I assume, I'm in Sydney, but look, we're having this conversation about history, and that's kind of bonkers, and the internet is allowing us to do that. So family historians who are doing their research using kind of behemoth research depositories like Ancestry are breaking those boundaries as well. So they're challenging them, but they're also using their research to think about their identity in different ways. So yes, I ask explicitly about that, and I'm very sensitive to it. And I've also met with Aboriginal family historians that took much, much longer to gain traction with, for obvious reasons. And they're using family history for profoundly political purposes, okay? And other migrant groups are as well. So it's very important. So people's historical research into their own family histories has very important individual effects, but also political, social, and cultural effects as well. So I think that question is really important. And to be honest, we haven't given a lot of thought to how it plays out in the Blue Mountains. It's not a terribly diverse community as far as I understand it, the Blue Mountains. There have been, there is long-standing Aboriginal populations, but it's, as far as I can, Australia is a very white nation still, despite the waves of migration. And there's no migration this year, and there won't be any migration for another year to come either. So it'll be interesting to see the impacts of that on the country, but it's something I'm very sensitive to, and most Australian researchers are. Not all, but most are. But yeah, a great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I wish you good luck with your research. Thank
you so much, and good luck with your studies.
Great. We're also, well, we've been talking about methodology and more general topic, but it's also good to focus a little bit more on the specificity of Australian context, because of course we've been talking about a very distant and reality with, well, most of us know well, and of course we might be wondering how it would be, to what extent it would be different to do the same type of research in a different context. But we had lots of questions. I think we can probably stop here also to let you go to bed. I think it's dark outside. I'm not mistaken.
It's been dark for hours, Stefano.
Okay, so I'm sorry for that. Anyway.
No, don't be. No, Australia, it gets dark very early. Don't worry.
And also your dog is probably calling you or something. Well, just let me say that as well. It was great, really great to have you here and to open this window on a very different context, very different type of methodology of public history work. Just let me say, before saying goodbye, that our next talk is going to be held in 2 weeks, as usual, on the 28th of October, our traditional time, that time, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The speaker would be Joris van Zondert from the Huygens Institute from the History of the Netherlands. The title of his talk is The Bestseller Code, Predicaments of Predict and High-Value Fiction, is a paper that lies at the intersection of computational statistics, machine learning, and literary production. So completely different, but well, it's good to vary. So thank you so much, Tanya, for being with us. Let me say that for my introduction to public humanities students, please don't go away, remain here. For all the others, thank you very much for attending this talk, and see you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much, Tanya.
Thank you.
It was so lovely meeting you. I really appreciate it, and thanks for hosting me. I hope to continue the conversation in the years ahead. Thank you so much.
And we want you back then in 3 years or 4 years to see what the results.
I hope to make it in person. That would be lovely.
Yeah, okay. But I think your dog is getting nervous. He wants you back.
Yeah. Can you see her? Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.